Romy and Richard, a worn-out couple, are traveling across the USA trying to reanimate their relationship. From their body language to the way they speak to one another, everything sheds light on the fact that it is going to be an extremely tough business to find what's already lost. Everything starts with a simple and ordinary breakfast in a cafe. Richard is easily annoyed with the waitress, who asks him a lot of questions, while Romy just orders her breakfast while smiling politely. And so, this is the first real difference between them that we see. Richard just wants everything given to him in an instant, and to his liking, without having to make serious decisions himself, while Romy is the opposite. But perhaps the first truly significant problem between them is visible at night in their hotel room, when Romy gets undressed. She looks behind her back and notices Richard watching her greedily. She gets into another room then, and comes out with a rope. They have lost all intimacy. The next morning, they visit the Bombay beach, a barren, dry place filled with bad omens. Richard and Romy talk in small sentences, and their communication has a million things in common with this place. Finally, Romy tells him that this beach will be the epicenter of the next big earthquake. And so, we have something to look forward to. Later that night they are in a bar, drinking whiskey by the counter. A girl is singing wonderfully behind them, and everybody's listening in silence. When the girl is done, Richard doesn't even turn his back to clap for her. Then he gets a little thirstier, and leaves Romy to get another drink. There, he meets the girl who was just singing and her friend. They say hi first, and Richard, as if a light switch turned on inside his brain, becomes playful and energetic in an instant. Urged to talk to new people, especially young, attractive girls, he buys some drinks for them. The girl seems to like him a lot, and his French accent seems to be helping. Romy sees this and tries not to get jealous. She stands up and starts walking around the bar, looking at the pictures of Indians. After a while, Richard comes to her and tells her to join them. One of the girls just told a great joke about Indians, and he wants her to hear it. The joke is terribly tasteless, but Richard nonetheless laughs like a maniac. Then he urges Romy to drink with them, but the latter prefers to sit alone outside the bar in silence, while her husband makes a big joke out of their entire relationship. Meanwhile, Richard, who's quite drunk at this point, starts laying out their relationship problems. He tells the two girls that he loves Romy, he really does, and he's ready to give her everything she wants, including this stupid vacation. Romy likes plants and vegetation. That's why they are there, instead of on some island getting laid all day long, which Richard would have preferred. But regardless, Romy doesn't want him sexually anymore. Suddenly, after saying this, he explodes in anger. This must really mean a lot to him. Romy enters the bar and asks him to leave, but bitterness has conquered Richard entirely at this point. All he wants now is to somehow hurt Romy in front of these two attractive women. So he starts talking in French with her, accusing her of being jealous. And then, in plain English, he tells the girls that Romy cannot have children. He makes a big joke out of it, too. Romy just storms out of the bar, and the other girls have no intention to stay with this bitter and miserable drunk either. Finally, all Richard can do is mock a man in a cowboy hat sitting across the counter, drinking his whiskey solemnly. The man doesn't reply. When Richard enters the hotel room later, Romy is already sleeping, or pretending to be asleep. Richard gets into bed, and his drunken face becomes hollow and strict. He brushes his fingers across Romy's face and gently, almost with love, starts touching her. Romy stops pretending to be asleep. Then she interrupts him again, but this frustrates Richard even more. Eventually it all grows into a fight, and the two end up on the floor. Richard has lost all control. Now he is an animal, locked on one thing only. And in this moment, the first thing that she can find on the floor is a table lamp. She clasps her hand around it and, in an instant, bangs it on Richard's head. A terrible knowledge comes to her abruptly. Richard isn't breathing. Slowly and quietly, as if an enormous weight just landed on her shoulders, she prepares, looks at what she has done one last time, and then leaves the hotel. Throughout the entire night, she walks and walks without stopping. Thoughts and an alien feeling rage in her head until eventually, the next morning, she makes a stop at a gas station. She drinks coffee, unblinking and black-eyed, and sees a car salesman from the window. From an ATM machine, she gets all her money and buys a car from him. This way, she can run away faster and more efficiently. And so, she starts driving across endlessly strewn empty roads, still in shock. She knows she is protecting herself, but her life as she knew it is over. Romy makes another stop later that day. She hasn't eaten in a long time. She can feel the eyes of everyone stinging on her cheeks. She avoids talking to the waitress and fears eye contact. Suddenly she sees a police car outside. And as two policemen come outside and start looking into her car, she stands up and heads towards the toilet. The waitress notices all her movements. Romy hides in the toilet. She holds her breath and is already about to implode from frustration when she hears a knock on the door. But instead of the police, to Romy's relief it is the waitress, telling her that they are gone. She can come out. And so, with the help of this kind waitress, she can eat in peace and then get back on the road again. But the anxieties of the day don't end with the previous incident. She sees police cars making a mandatory checkup. She cannot go back now, it will be too suspicious. She has to keep going and stop the car. The policeman asks her a lot of questions after asking for the license and registration. And he doesn't like the anxious and frustrated answers from this woman, who looks as if she hasn't slept in weeks. So he asks to check the trunk, which turns out to be clean, so they let her go. That evening, Romy checks into a motel to spend the night. Afraid that somebody might come in during the night, she pulls the table against the door and tries to go to sleep. But as soon as she shuts her eyes, nightmares come to her. Finally, she manages to wake up from this horrible dream. Right away, she gets dressed and leaves the place. In the next scene, she's sitting at a bar, much more tired than before. Sleep is a comfort that's not available to her anymore. It is as clear as day, she is suffering. One incident was enough to ruin her entire life. Now she must live with this memory forever, and she doesn't know how to endure this much suffering. Across from her sits a young man, who gazes at her intently. Romy gets frustrated with him quickly, and asks what his problem is. But despite this, they have a short and kind conversation in the end. They agree on one thing: both must be somewhere far away from here tomorrow. The man leaves before her, and he does go extremely far. In the next scene, when Romy gets back on the road, she sees police lights once more, but this time it isn't for a checkup, it's because of an accident. Romy looks out of the window as she passes the commotion, and sees the ruined bike and the man she was just speaking to. This moment makes her think. And while driving across endlessly stretched roads, she realizes that she can change her life for the better, that the one and only irreparable damage a human suffers is the loss of life itself. With wisdom and clear thinking, she might still be able to find peace. And so, in the next scene, we see her come out of her car in the morning and enter a police station. She asks to talk to the detective, who turns out to be an unusually kind man. Romy immediately goes ahead and says the truth. But the detective stops her and asks her some mandatory questions to verify her identity. After a few scribbles in his notes, he exits the room and then comes back in again. Even though Romy just told him that she was a murderer, this man's still smiling kindly at her. Now he asks some technical questions about what happened, and leaves the room to verify that her answers are true. And if it is, then Romy will need a lawyer. This is the moment when Romy breaks down. How is it that she ended up here, far away from home, in a detective's office? Romy is sure that she's going to jail, but when the detective returns, he is smiling even more widely, and his tone of voice is encouraging. He says that his initial guess turned out to be true. Romy wouldn't have murdered anybody. Richard is alive. He is in a hospital, and he told him himself that he had a dispute with his wife and, in a heated moment, slipped and hurt his head badly. This is all the detective is going to believe. He will forget that she was ever there. She is free to go and talk to her husband about this. She can breathe freely again. She feels alive after being emotionally dead. This unbelievably enormous relief makes her see the world through the eyes of an infant. She visits Richard in the next scene, who's so ashamed of his actions. They talk calmly for a while about what they did after that night, and how they ended up here. For some reason, Richard thinks that Romy is going to go back to Paris with him, and they are going to resume their marriage as if nothing happened. But Romy has no intentions to go back there, in that state of living. And so, she says farewell and leaves Richard behind. Her will to live is rekindled. In the next scene, a trailer stops for her. The driver says that he's heading to Las Vegas. Romy thinks for a second, and then decides that she is going there too. She is ready to go anywhere and experience life all over again. Live life to the fullest. In the evening of the next day, she's already in Las Vegas, eating a burger. A woman in a bunny costume named Charlene sits with her and takes off her shoes. They must have really hurt, since she's so relieved. Romy is eager to communicate with everybody, so she starts the conversation. She enjoys talking with this unusually dressed person. But after 2 minutes, Charlene's phone rings, and she has to go. Later that night, Romy sees what Charlene does for a living. Dressed as a bunny, alongside 2 men dressed as Elvis, she tries to catch some tourists and take pictures with them, to later charge them some money. It seems that she's quite successful at it. Romy says hi to her again, and she meets Elvis too. Eventually she ends up in Charlene's apartment that night, and stays there. Charlene tells her that she can stay as long as she pays a small rent. Additionally, she offers to start working as a waitress at a bowling alley. But as they understand the next day, Romy's not much of a roller skater, so she takes up the role of a bunny in the end. The work clearly isn't for her, however. She gets tired quickly, and when even the Elvises start to ignore her, she gets into the casino to find a toilet. There, dressed like this, she catches the attention of a man named Diego. When Romy passes him by, her ears fall off, so Diego quickly grabs them and goes after her. He must have gotten a terribly incorrect idea. He gives her the piece of the costume that fell from her head, and then asks her if she wants to get a drink. Romy says yes. She feels as if she doesn't have any reason to say no. But suddenly, Diego asks her about the price, and Romy has to clarify to him that even though she looks like one, she isn't a... Then she asks him for the direction of a bathroom and leaves. There, standing in front of a mirror, she has some time to reflect on the latest events of her life. Perhaps starting life from scratch isn't as easy as it seemed at first. When she exits the bathroom, completely changed, she sees Diego waiting for her. He asks her to drink with him once more, but this time with completely different intentions. Firstly, he explains himself to her. He only comes to this city to have relationships with... It's easier for him. After that, they engage in ordinary small talk. Diego seems to view Romy as a mysterious person. The French accent, the costume, and her personality definitely don't fit it at all. It all contributes to her mysteriousness. Romy opens up, but only partially. She says that apart from coming out of a very long relationship, there is no real reason for her to even be there, let alone work as a bunny. Diego understands that this is all she's willing to say, so even though his curiosity isn't fully satisfied, he leaves the subject respectfully. Romy starts to really open up when they come out of the casino. She starts talking on and on about what she is up to now. She intends to float around in the world, follow her breath, and experience life to the fullest. Abruptly and with one smart motion, Diego stops her and gives her a long kiss. In the end, when they break up, he says that it was only to make her stop talking. But whatever the reason was, it definitely made Romy's blood boil in her veins. She runs back to him and embraces him again. They spend that night together in Diego's hotel room. It's been a long time since Romy heartily fell in love with somebody. She returns to Charlene that evening, awaiting a warm welcome, but when she enters the apartment, she realizes that Charlene has grown extremely hostile towards her. She spits at her to return the bunny costume and go wherever she stayed last night. She must be thinking that Romy is one of the people who makes good connections with others only to benefit herself. Charlene must have felt used, but the way she doesn't even give Romy a chance forces the latter to leave without objecting at all. She gets a room in the same hotel where she stayed last night. It's clear that all she can think of is Diego. He seems to be representing all that might be amazing in her new life. And finally, after smoking a cigarette or two, she calls his room, waiting to hear his voice, but a woman takes the phone instead of Diego. The man doesn't come to the phone, and tells Romy through the mouth of this woman that he will call her tomorrow. Romy is awake most nights, looking at the view. In the morning, she finds a letter at her door. It's from Diego, and he gives her his address. In case she finds herself lost during her journey, she can feel free to visit him. Romy goes there in the next scene. In the middle of nowhere, under an overcast sky, and on a dusty and windy road, she walks to find his house. Finally, she finds it. The small settlement seems to contain no signs of life. It's completely empty. She knocks on his door and, after a while, decides to enter it. The house is empty too. Throughout the entire day, Romy waits for Diego. In the night, she is woken up by the rumbling of his truck. Diego lights his cigarette, comes out of the car quietly, and throws one lazy hi at her as he passes her by indifferently. Then he enters the house without even inviting her in. He lays down on a couch and doesn't say a word. Romy is surprised and offended. She asks him what the reason for the letter was, if he didn't even want her to come. He makes one toothless joke, and right away, he apologizes to her. He's drunk. That night, Romy stays there, and the next morning, she sees him sobered up and completely changed. It seems like he works as a park ranger. Caringly, he asks her if she still wants to stay with him, lets her know where the keys to the truck are, and leaves to go downtown. Later that afternoon, Romy finds a place where her next workplace might be. It's a small cafe that needs a waitress. And so, she has everything ready. She can really settle down and start a new, interesting life. It all seems extremely easy. This is how Diego and Romy's effortlessly happy and easygoing lives begin. Gradually, they get to know one another better and better. And this process cannot go without an incident. This incident happened at a bar one evening. It seems like Diego comes to her a lot. People know him here, and he seems well respected in this bunch. One drunk man then attempts to pick up Romy. The latter naturally lets him down easy, but the man is clearly looking for a fight. He insults her as he walks away, and Diego knocks him out. Then he buys a beer for him. He does all this calmly and with precision, like a well-trained bar fighter. People all around cheer for him, but not Romy. In the next scene, Diego explains to her why he acted exactly in that manner. He says that there is no glory in winning. The way he speaks about the incident says a lot about him. He's reliable, well-reserved, and respected. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Romy feels a tide of emotion, and she lets it out in words, telling him that she loves him. Diego is taken back. Openly, he reminds her of her own words. She was done with love a few days ago. Romy doesn't say anything about it at all. She looks like a kid who's coughing while doing something bad. And we do not hear how their conversation ends. But we see them in the next scene, visiting Diego's sister-in-law. Her name is Billy, and she seems to be an awfully nice person, living with her family. For the first time, we see Diego sneak away from people to cough uncontrollably. Romy doesn't notice anything suspicious or special, but Diego's coughing seems extreme. Later that night, he barely controls himself not to explode in coughing. He's successful in hiding it. The next morning, Romy starts working at the cafe. Missy, the manager, shows her around and lets her know about her responsibilities. When she gets back home, she starts preparing an apple tart and tells Diego about the job. It is clear that Romy sees the future in Diego, but we cannot say that Diego feels the same. Almost with indifference and untimely rudeness, he lets her know that she's not wanted here forever. He thinks that Romy's just passing by. Romy is offended. There was no reason to speak this way. She is just passing through, especially after this interaction. The next day, they visit Billy and Joe, Diego's brother. Everything about their house and their appearance speaks to the fact that they are extremely poor. They have 2 kids and are waiting for the 3rd one, and it seems like the only source of income for them is Diego. He and Romy spend the entire afternoon with them, and the time they spend is filled with bitter pictures. Billy is trying her best to remain positive and to hide their insufferable way of living, but Joe puts no effort into hiding the ugliness of his pathetic and hopeless existence. A number of conflicts break out while the 4 are together, but none of them escalates too much. Romy gets to know the children and spends some time alone with Billy, who tells her all she knows about Diego's coughing. It seems like he has been like this since coming back from the war. Eventually Joe, who's been grumpy the entire time, calls Billy in with an unexpectedly cheerful tone of voice and asks her to do the cheerleader routine in front of them. Rage starts stirring in Romy as she watches Billy jump up and down, until she explodes and dashes towards her, screeching to stop it immediately and think about her child in her belly. She storms out. Diego lets them know how stupid they are, and he leaves as well. They are angry, but clearly instead they should be sad. On the way back, Diego stops in the middle of the barren landscape and drops off some gallons of water. Countless people who try to cross the border through the desert end up dying of thirst. If anybody sees him doing this, he will get in trouble for sure. This simple but extremely thoughtful action makes Romy want to embrace him, but Diego falls back. And so, the time comes to finally talk about what's happening between them. It's very simple for Diego. In the beginning, he said what he was looking for, and he didn't lie. He's not in love with her, and never intended to spend this much time with her either. Romy doesn't believe him at all. The time they spent together seems contrary to her, and so, she asks him what's really going on. For a second, Diego is silent. The indifferent look on his face fades for a moment, but he says nothing. He just gets into his truck and they drive away. By the evening, he sets out for a drive, and drops Romy off at the house to pack her things and go. He doesn't want to see her face when he gets back. And so Romy spends most of the night at the bar, until the generous barman gives her a shelter. The next day after work, Missy takes her home. Now Romy stays with Indians, on the condition that she doesn't address them like aliens from another dimension. The grandmother, a sage, blesses her and chooses a name for her. It's Mapia, the sky. Then next morning, at work, Missy tells Romy that her grandmother thinks that Romy was with a child. It seems like she's expecting a boy. It is impossible, though. Romy cannot have children. Her body rejects it. In the next scene, however, she hears it from the doctor. She really is pregnant, and this pregnancy is going well. There is no reason to await another disaster. That evening, she goes into the bar, perhaps even hoping to see the father of her child. Diego's truck is stranded outside, so he must be there. The lady in the bar tells her that Diego is in the bathroom, and he doesn't feel very well. Soon, Diego himself will come out. He really does look terrible. There is no life force in his movements, but once he sees Romy, a flicker of energy sparks inside of him, and he starts moving towards her. Without saying anything, they embrace each other. This is their reunion, easygoing and sad. Diego tells her everything in the next scene. He suffers from radiation sickness. His entire body was exposed to a high dose of radiation in the war, and now he pays the price of it. Romy fell in love with a terminally ill man. Slowly but surely his body is getting weaker, to the point where he cannot even make love to Romy. But that isn't enough to ruin this moment for them. Romy starts remembering the day they first met. And since it is a day of revealing secrets, she tells him about the pregnancy. Diego is speechless. Slowly, he stands up, gets dressed, and leaves the room. His coughing is so bad in the next scene that we are sure he won't be able to see his child. And this is exactly what he tells Romy outside that afternoon. And so Diego lets all his malice out, leaving Romy speechless and in need of support. This, however, she gets from the sage. She lets her know that she's been given a beautiful life. She should embrace it rather than fear it. Nobody can change the past. It was all meant to be. And whatever happens, she will be there for her. Romy was given the name Sky for a reason. She is always changing, and that is okay. Romy spends the rest of the day with Missy and her grandmother, and somehow their presence alone is enough to help her find her peace. Perhaps for the first time, Romy is able to see the meaning behind her new name. Time passes, and her belly gradually gets bigger. In the next scene, Missy and Romy are sitting outside the cafe when the boy from the bar comes running to them. He doesn't say anything specifically, but his face, his body language, and his hesitant words assure Romy that something bad has happened to Diego. She jumps up from the chair, awaiting a disaster, and follows the boy. She spends the rest of the day and night with Diego. Lying on her chest, Diego coughs uncontrollably and breathes heavily. He fears looking into her eyes, because he knows he'll see tears in there. This is what he feared the most. This is why he chose to keep the distance while wearing the mask of an indifferent, cool, and preserved man. But all of that was a lie. In truth, he was just afraid of hurting someone he loved. All of that is in the past, though. Now Diego suddenly chooses to lift his head up courageously and tells her that he loves her. And he takes back the words he said last time. Romy should tell their son that he was always wanted. Before this, Romy managed to stay quiet, but now she explodes in tears. All she wanted to hear were these words, but now they hurt. The pain isn't an insufferable thought. They are giving her the most important thing in the world, meaning. And so time passes, and Romy remains living in this house with her son, Diego. And the sky is clear.